Trust, ethics, politics, and maps. So today I'd like to share some of my thoughts on these particular topics, and it stems really from the presumption that the world is awash with bad maps, fake maps, maps that enrage cartographers. And I know this because some have enraged me, and what I'd like to ask is whether this is a new phenomenon and what, if anything, we need to do about it. And these really are issues that plague me, as my overarching professional role is to help people not only make better maps, but help people understand how to interpret and understand the maps they look at and be able to better assess the veracity of them. So let's dive straight in. I'm going to start with a quote made by a Welsh politician, Aneurin Bevan, in the late 1940s. His actual quote was, "This is my truth, tell me yours," on the way in which politicians of the time seemingly avoided telling the truth in favour of alternative facts. But what he was really saying was, "This is what I believe, but I'm open and willing to listen to your opinion, which might be different to mine." It's also the title of a great album by the Welsh band Manic Street Preachers, which I strongly recommend. If there's anything you take away from this talk at all, have a listen to that album. Anyway, I stole Bevan's quote, and I've thought about it in relation to our domain of maps, of cartography. And so what this presentation is really about is the alternative truths we can find in maps. And the reason is that that might be the case. Maybe we can identify maps that are right. Maybe we can find some that are wrong. Actually, it's likely none are right and equally none are wrong. Instead, they all actually tell different shades of the truth. So I'm going to explore this through an ethics lens. It's in vogue. People are concerned with the idea of ethics in maps. And what I'm going to try and do is look at that by thinking about the truthfulness that's imbued in maps, or perhaps the untruthfulness that we see in maps. So if you ask 10 cartographers to make a map, you're going to get 10 different maps. It might seem obvious, or maybe it isn't obvious, but it'd be boring if all maps were the same. This idea of conceptualizing and visualizing data on a map is really an output of a very creative and a very human process. So there really isn't any single one-size-fits-all solution to a particular mapping objective, nor really an optimum way of representing and communicating the mapped information. And sometimes maps are better, sometimes maps are poorer, but very few maps are fundamentally correct. So experience, intuition, talent are useful in creating a map, but we're all very different, and we all bring very, very different sensibilities to our work. So not all maps are made equally. Let's have a look at this map. If I said to you, let's make an advertising map for a telephone operator, mobile cell phone operator, and the whole point of the map is to prove to people that their network is the best. Okay, well, you're going to create a map that looks a little bit like this. You're going to have a title that really sort of emphasizes that your data's strong. You're going to show a map that proves that the network is the best it could possibly be everywhere. You're tilting the map, you're using 3D, you're using prisms where height presumably means something, but we don't know what. But then look at the actual colours, and you can see here that the darker pink is where T-Mobile claims they have nationwide data network. Well, that's not nationwide if it's only in the darker pink. Okay, the slightly lighter pink is a service partner network. Well, okay, but that's not T-Mobile's nationwide data network, but it seems to fill all the areas in between. But then you look at the very light pink, which is no coverage, and actually the reason that the map is tilted now becomes obvious, because all of those no coverage areas are actually hidden by the heights of the prism bars. So it's an absolute classic advertising map. Advertising maps are very good at drawing a map based on needs for advertising the product, whether it's the truth or not. And as if this sort of map isn't problematic enough, then I'm going to actually play you a short video. It's a T-Mobile advert that was it was actually in the middle of a Super Bowl break a few years ago. I'm going to play you the whole thing. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So here's Miley, and let's sit back and listen for a couple of minutes.
Do it for the phones. Maps don't lie. Maps don't lie. They actually don't.
You got a voice, Molly. Use it. Do it for the phones.
Signals always slowing when you walk out the door. You got big dreams of 5G, faster than before. We all just need connection. Let's do it for the phones. They do so much for you. When they're out there all alone, there's something we can do. So don't settle for less, they deserve the best. More coverage, coast to coast. T-Mobile. Twice the speed of Verizon's network, 4 times bigger too. When you download your favorite music, the leader is here for you. 5G bars in more places. Let's do it for the phone. They do so much for you. When they're out there all alone, there's something we can do. So don't settle for less, you deserve the best. More coverage, coast to coast. T-Mobile, look at these maps, they don't lie. More coverage for less than the other guys. Look at these maps, they don't lie. And faster speeds nationwide. Let's do it for the phones. They do so much for you. When they're out there all alone, there's something we can do. So don't settle for less, they deserve the best. More coverage, coast to coast. Just make the call. Larger than them all. Just make the call. Let's do it for the phones.
There we go. Smiley, and a bit of Dolly in there too. Well, maps don't lie, apparently, except they do, I'm afraid. And how do we know that maps lie? Well, Marc Monnier's classic text from 30 years ago proved it. If you've never seen or read this book, then I thoroughly recommend it. An instant classic when first published in 1991. Marc revealed how the choices map makers make, consciously or unconsciously, mean that every map inevitably presents only one of many possible stories about the places it depicts. So maps do have the potential to lie, and as I said a moment ago, the maps are not all made equally. But maybe Marc Monnier was beaten to it as well, because REM knew this in 1985 with their song Maps and Legends. Another great musical tip for you today, the classic album Fables of the Reconstruction. This was actually the B-side to the 1987 hit, The One I Love. Okay, should we play a little bit of REM?
The map that she painted didn't seem real. He just said.
Okay, that's enough. I probably would better get back to the cartography, otherwise we'd just play music all day. Okay, so do you believe Miley? Do you believe Dolly? Do you believe Marc Monnier or REM? And I guess it depends on your truth. Fundamentally, maps are made by people, but what types of people? And what of their ethics? To sort of think about this, I'm going to refer to the work of Michael Carell from Tableau, who recently characterised that there's basically 3 types of people when it comes to making maps. Honest people, liars, and bullshit artists. Now, both an honest person and a liar are at least interested in the truth. Here's an honest person, wants to tell you the truth, but in order to tell you the truth, they have to know what the truth is, whereas the liar, here's a liar, wants to convince you of something that they know is not true, which also entails that they know what is actually true and are just choosing to say the opposite. The bullshit artist, and here we are, here's one, by contrast, couldn't care less about what is true or false. Their goal is just to say whatever will accomplish their aim, and they don't much care if what they're saying is true or not. Now, I suspect we all think of ourselves as ethical map makers. It's very difficult to identify an unethical map maker unless you really know what you're looking for, because they often hide in plain sight. Take, for instance, the maps that I make. I'd like to think I follow ethical ideals, but my maps are made as part of my work for a privately held GIS company. I focus on helping people make better maps, but whatever I might claim, by default, they are also made using the software built by my company, the services that my company provides, and the content that my company provides. So, in many respects, they're just marketing. But I'm also supposed to be a professional cartographer, so does that automatically make me and my maps trustworthy? Am I immune to this accusation of lying or being a BS artist? Well, let's take a look at a few untrustworthy maps to see if we can disentangle some of this problem. I'm going to start with one of mine. This is a map I made in 2009, but I need to go back a year before that to the summer of 2008. When I attended the Esri user conference. This is before I worked at the company, and I was shocked at what I saw had won a major map gallery prize that year. I personally didn't think much of the map itself. I sort of sat there in the closing ceremony amongst a few thousand people and said to my better half, I'm going to win this next year. I'm going to make a map that's going to win this contest. Well, my better half Linda came up with the idea. I executed it. And it was really a map where I was trying to identify something to do with ancestry, and I was trying to hook in to the way in which many people want to understand where they're from, where do they come from, where do they hail from, what's their ancestry. And of course, a lot of Americans like to point to this Emerald Isle and Irish ancestry. So I thought, what better map to hook into this than to get a lot of people wondering if their name is on this map, a map that they can look at, interrogate, investigate, and pore over to see whether in fact they can identify any Irish ancestry. So I got hold of a cruddy data set, very dubious origins. I filled with caveats and limitations, but this map seems to give credence and accuracy and interest to what, I have to be honest, was a pretty useless data set. I'm going to display this in a map gallery. It's a very large space with many maps, so I needed to get eyes on this map. So several months ahead of the conference, the company released this map of the map gallery, and I actually love the scale bar in the bottom left. It's totally inaccurate. We were all asked to select a panel, and it's all about location, right? I needed a panel, and these are the green splodges here on this map, where it's going to be seen. And I recall having to get up at 2 a.m. when this particular panel selection app went live, and wanted to pick a panel next to the main door and next to where the food and drink's going to be served at the opening event. So I knew where people were going to walk in, and I knew where the food and drink was going to be. So I made sure I put my map on the panel that was closest to the entrance and closest to the food and drinks carts. So this is 2009, and that's my map, hung on my chosen panel. And I then spent the week attending the conference, but also looking at people's reaction to the map. And for added hooks, I ran competitions for people to find hidden Easter eggs, the famous surname O'Dangermond, and the other famous surname Obama, who had just won his first term as president. I think it's so important to put Easter eggs into maps. Very important for people to have some fun and to find things. But it was popular. A lot of people stopped by and looked at this map. Once they got their free beer and a bite to eat, they got up close to it. They actually touched the map. It was the sort of reaction that I wasn't necessarily expecting, but it was a very human reaction. People were engaging with the map in a very human way, trying to find something out from it by looking very closely at it. And my very favourite picture that I got that week is of this gentleman. I wish I'd stopped and had a chat with him and to see whether he found his surname. But he's looking for his ancestry. He's picked a quiet moment and he's looking very closely at the map. And in all honesty, this was the person I was targeting with the map, and I'd like to think this gentleman actually put his vote into the competition because it won. So the map that was nowhere in even my thinking a year previously, but when I simply tried to create a map to win a competition, did actually win the competition. And even to this day, people think that I have a very deep interest in ancestry. I got a trophy, I got a congratulatory hug from Jack O'Dangermond. And I suspect in some respects it ended up actually changing the course of my career, and I ended up working at Esri. It wasn't part of the plan at that particular time. So I guess BS artist, even though I would contend that most of my maps, if not all of them, are, pretty ethically made. Let's go to another one, a very famous map that we saw in 2019. This is a map made of the path of Hurricane Dorian, a very famous map which was referred to as the Sharpie Gate incident. Perhaps a perfect example of caring more about the appearance of the data and how it's portrayed rather than the underlying truth. I guess in many ways it's easy for people to conflate the data with the truth when a map or a chart is presented as showing the data. But this is when President Trump drew an extra sort of extension to the potential path of the hurricane so that it moved into Alabama, and this caused all manner of upset. Well, who do we trust? Do we trust the organisation that made the map? Who bothered looking for the source of the map's data, for instance, or further, if that source is trustworthy? How many of the general readers or people watching the news conference understood the notion of the cone of uncertainty for the path of a hurricane even, and perhaps mistake it for the breadth of imminent destruction, regardless of whether it was going to hit Alabama or not? And furthermore, should we not just simply believe the President of the United States anyway? I mean, we should. But maybe we should also be sceptical as readers of the information graphics put in front of us. Here's another one. It's actually a map that my brother found, made to support a planning application for a brand new reservoir in the UK. He lives in this tiny little village called Swayton, which you can see middle bottom here with the arrow. And that area in pink is the proposed reservoir, and the area in grey overprinted on the map is the infrastructure associated with the reservoir. And my brother and many other villagers around the area are up in arms about this potential impact on their lives. This is an enormous engineering project, potentially going to destroy their fairly pleasant rural lifestyle. It's a very official looking map. You wouldn't like this if this came through your front door and you were asked to give your opinion on it. But here's the same information presented in a completely different style, with lots of what are called opportunities now. And this area next to where my brother lives is identified as a biodiversity opportunity. And when he looks at this map, he starts talking about opening a leisure company, a canoe company, a sailboat company, or maybe a coffee stall to, take advantage of all of the people that are going to come for recreational opportunities around this reservoir. I mean, it's exactly the same map as the previous one I showed, but it's received by the public in an extremely different way. And it's important, therefore, to remember, in terms of how we communicate and how we engage with people, the design of the map has a major bearing upon the reaction we're going to get. So the way in which we draw maps with our Sharpie pens is as important as what we draw, and we should always use these cartography pens wisely. But ultimately, we have incredible power at our fingertips to create versions of the truth that suit our particular truth. What about our modern digital maps then? We've had a look at a couple of examples, but let's perhaps test this a bit further. Is the problem with modern digital maps, rather than with the likes of me and the US president messing around with the maps to, distort people voting for a map or distort people's perception of a hurricane? Well, Greg Bessinger of the New York Times editorial board in 2021, in an op-ed, claimed modern maps had become terrible, using his words. I won't go through all of these, but we're going to test some of these maps because he's suggesting too many of our digital maps these days are sellouts, that they're ethically just not worth the paper that they're drawn on or the screens that they're illustrated on. Well, I would argue none of this is particularly new if we look back in cartographic times. They're regurgitated, well-worn tropes that I'd like to test just for a little moment or two. So we'll start with this map, this pair of maps. Were once maps perfect and free of misinformation? Well, no. For good reason, maps have always omitted information, so they're versions of the truth that stakeholders want you to see or perhaps don't want you to see. They perhaps contain or omit information that changes the content according to their particular needs and wants. So these are two beautiful UK Ordnance Survey 1 to 25,000 map sheets published in 1961, so the early 60s. They show part of Hampshire in the sort of lower middle England, and they're detailed. They give the aura of accuracy, authenticity, completeness. These are documents of scientific record. Okay, well, let's just splice them together and take a look at these two areas here. Let's zoom in. And these are two areas of unassuming countryside, perfect for a nice walk along the footpaths, the bridleways, the streams on a Sunday afternoon perhaps. There's Roman roads that go through, there's orchards, there's woodland. Lovely. You can only imagine the sort of wildlife and the peace and tranquility you're going to experience if you venture out into these areas. Except 11 years before these maps were made, in 1950, these two areas were designated as atomic weapons research establishments in the UK, and these are where Britain's nuclear missiles were assembled. In the bottom left is AWE Aldermaston, and in the top right, AWE Burfield. And along with 3,000 other sensitive sites, according to the UK government, they were omitted from UK national maps. If we look at modern-day satellite imagery, of course, we can see exactly what's going on in those two areas. They are examples of imagery that has not been deliberately pixelated. You quite often find imagery that's trying to obscure sensitive sites. It has been pixelated. But there's no countryside in these two areas. This is heavily secured industrial, military complexes. Okay, well, maybe we can have a look at what's going on these on maps from today to see whether the situation has changed. Well, this is the UK's Ordnance Survey products today, and they still omit details. There's no labels to tell you what these places are or what you might find there. They show building outlines, so this isn't pleasant green countryside anymore, but still, we're not clear what those buildings are. This is OpenStreetMap. This dataset actually does name the sites with their atomic weapons establishment prefix, Aldermaston and Burfield, and they're actually shaded in a light pink as well, which shows their particular type of character as being different from the surrounding area. So OpenStreetMap, perhaps a little bit more truthful maybe? This is actually Esri's base map that goes all in on saying exactly what exists at Aldermaston. It doesn't even give you the name Aldermaston, it just says it's the Atomic Weapons Establishment, not even just AWE. But Burfield in the top right is sort of blended somewhat innocuously into the map. There's nothing there, absolutely nothing, not even building outlines. So there's a few maps of the present day. Who do you trust? Which map is truthful? Which could be trusted more than the others? So are today's digital maps any worse than those of yesteryear? Not really. Maps still lie, which means that Miley is lying, I guess. And are maps made now by bad actors using bad data to deliberately tell bad stories? Were maps made by people with much higher morals and ethics than today? Well, maybe not. Here's a Nazi propaganda map from the early 1930s. This is at the time at which Adolf Hitler was beginning to gain control of his party, well ahead of World War II. But you wouldn't necessarily imagine, just from present-day perception, that Nazi Germany, or the precursor to Nazi Germany, would be offering up propagandist maps that shows the oppression of the Germans or the German nation. Well, that's exactly what this map is. We've got a light pink to represent the German Empire, but surrounding it we've got red, which is traditionally used to mark danger. This is indicated as the borderland in distress, so they perhaps feel under some level of attack. And look at the dark black ink of the surrounding oppressive countries, the non-Germanic peoples' regions. This presents a view of a very insular Germany, and one that is very somewhat scared. So propaganda is clearly nothing new at all. I mean, this sort of modern social media map employs exactly the same scare tactics with the same sort of use of reds and blacks. It's totally misleading. Chinese-owned farmland in America. Well, it doesn't show land ownership. What it actually shows is entire counties shaded as red if any small part of that county, no matter how small, is foreign owned. Well, of course, the whole county isn't foreign owned. That would be ludicrous. But the map is trying to exaggerate the amount of land that or basically ink on a page that the map is portraying in order to give that impression. So it falsely implies way more area is owned. Here's a map that did the rounds very, very famously to illustrate the strength of President Trump's 2016 win, the classic Breitbart map, which is a total fabrication. People have looked at this and tried to understand exactly what the way in which it's been coloured red and blue mean. Is it counties? Is it precincts? No one really knows. We're going to come back to this election map in a moment because it's quite an important tool to explore truth in maps. But what we can see is that unethical map makers have always existed. Some operate individually, some on behalf of a propagandist machine they're paid to work for. But somehow it's just as incumbent on the people looking at the maps to try to disentangle truth from fiction when they're looking at these sorts of products. Were maps never used to warp people's impression of a place? Well, again, they always have been. Here is MacDonald Gill's wonderful 1914 Wonderground map of London, commissioned by Frank Pick of the Underground Electric Railways Company of London as a mechanism to improve the brand. Now, the Underground Railway at the time in London was used almost solely by commuters. It was a pretty miserable place. It was dark, it was dank, it was smoky. And this design was intended to distract the commuters from their travelling conditions. And really, as a way to promote and improve off-peak travel use. So what are we looking at? Well, it's a mixture of cartoon, fantasy. There's some topological accuracy in terms of where streets are positioned. But it's basically an instant visual hit with the travelling public. It looks wonderful. It portrays London with as a medieval town with a medieval style and decorative cursive scripts and chivalric shields. That's not easy to say. And there's even dragons in Hyde Park in the middle. It's just beautiful. Of course, it looked nothing like London, and it bears absolutely zero resemblance to what it's like to travel on the Underground, either then or now. But it's a nice map, and that's the point. People enjoy looking at nice maps. But have we always advertised on maps? Have we changed the way maps are used for advertising? No, not really. I mean, here's a Google map. People often forget that Google aren't really interested in the mapping landscape in terms of cartography and providing people with a map. They're an advertising company. Alphabet, the parent company, makes its money off of adverts. And what they did very cleverly was realise very early on that maps were a fantastic billboard for positioning adverts on. Now, I gave this talk at the Royal Geographical Society in London a short while ago, and I used this really as an illustration of what happens when you just zoom into Google Maps. And this gave me my view. This is what Google thought I wanted to see when I zoomed into this particular part of the world. So it showed me a whole load of cocktail bars, and it showed me actually a place called Ken's Bar down on Cromwell Road. I actually never went to it, but it's advertising a particular view of London that it thought I might be interested in when I'm going to the Royal Geographical Society up on Exhibition Road there. I've never been to the Champagne Bar either, as it happens. But maps have always been used to modify the content to suit the people to which they're trying to sell something to. Okay, is the alleged selling out of cartography because maps used to be made by experts but now are made by anyone due to technological developments? This is a wonderful fallacy in cartography, the assumption that great maps or high quality maps are always made by properly trained cartographers. Well, here are some great examples maps that you may recognise, some of which at least I hope you'll recognise, and which were all made or envisioned by non-cartographers, people with no cartographic training whatsoever. Proof that you do not need to be a cartographer to make a good map. And let's not forget that the word cartography didn't even exist until the 1870s, so to claim in some way that cartography is an untouchable discipline is a fallacy in and of itself. It's not the sole realm of specialised experts at all, perhaps a little arrogant to claim that it is. But these maps, Heinrich Behrend's panoramas, Charles Booth's poverty maps, Pearsall's A to Z or A to Z maps of London, John Snow's map of cholera, although it was actually created by a guy called Charles Sheffin rather than Snow himself, Beck, an electrical engineer, Charles Maynard, a French engineer, Bowman and Nightingale, a nurse and statistician. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful maps, none of which were made by real cartographers or cartographers in a traditional sense. And here's the modern equivalent. You don't need to be a trained cartographer now, as these contemporary map makers also prove. So we've got Cameron Booth, Geraldine Sarmiento, Eleanor Lutz, who's created some wonderful work. Roger Smith from New Zealand, his landscape cartography is second to none. Anton Thomas with his beautiful pictorial maps. Johnny Walker with his artistry. Mike Hall, a fantastic illustrator, and some of his cartographic works illustrating many, many different books and atlases. And Jane Tomlinson as well. So back to what I said right at the start. It's too simplistic to say that access to technology has made maps worse, and a map is still very much the product of its maker, and not just the technology used to make it. So I would contend that instead of what Greg Bessinger is saying in the New York Times op-ed, things are the same as it ever was.
Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was.
I could listen to that all day. So none of these problems are particularly new problems. But let's perhaps now develop this idea of ethics a little bit more deeply. Is this something we actually need to be concerned with? Is it something new? And I hope I've demonstrated already that by looking at maps through a truthfulness lens, or perhaps we could call it an ethical lens, you can identify maps that are less than truthful, albeit that they claim to be, or at least give the appearance of being truthful. Well, okay, I said we'd come back to election maps. This is a very famous photograph taken by Reuters journalist Trey Yingst as President Trump moved into the White House for the first of his presidential terms. And, I'll be frank, who wouldn't have a map of their victory on their wall? I certainly would. At the time, Reuters quoted Trump as saying, "Here, you can take that," as he passed out copies of the map from his desk. "That's the final map of the numbers. It's pretty good, right? The red is obviously us." Well, the map isn't wrong. And a lot of people were up in arms about this map, saying that the map is wrong. It's not. It's truthful. It does present a somewhat partisan view of that truth. Geography, population density, electoral geography, the map design decisions do modify the message of this map in a very specific way. And the design of this obviously suited Trump's view of the truth because it's got an awful lot of red on it. But this type of map is only one form of mapping an election result, and other truths exist. Now, I know who made this map. I'm not going to say who, but the company were asked to create a map to show Trump's compelling victory. Now, they could have chosen any number of different map designs, but they knew what they were doing. They knew the map had to look like this in order to gain approval and in order to be put on the wall. Like I said, is it truthful? Yes. Is it a little misleading? Yes. Is it unethical? Well, you can make your own minds up. I would say no. It's just one of many different ways of viewing the results, and maps can make the results appear in different ways. Now, do I think I can make a better, more balanced version? Well, the answer to that is yes, I do, if I wanted to make a bipartisan map. So that's exactly what I actually set about doing. In early March 2018, I made this map. It's a daisy-metric dot density map of the 2016 election result. It's one vote, one dot, and overnight it went a little bit viral, which was a pity because I hadn't actually finished it, and it was simply me being excited that I had cajoled ArcGIS Pro to actually draw all the dots. But anyway, Now, remember, this is a screen grab from Twitter, or X as it is now, which of course nobody uses now. But to date, this tweet was liked over 10,000 times, retweeted over 5,000 times, been seen by 2 million people apparently, and led to 250,000 active engagements, whatever they are, I've no idea. And note also my avatar had hair, so this was made back when I did have a little bit of hair. But of course, what does the map look like? It's a little bit more balanced in terms of red and blue. If you're going to map all of the red counties that Trump won in some shade of red, then you are going to map an awful lot of land as red, and the rest of the country as small pockets of blue. But that's not how people vote, and land does not vote, as the sort of white area on this map shows. And inevitably, memes started. This is one I particularly loved from Thomas de Boer. He mashed up my map into Trey Yingst's photograph. Well, which map appears more truthful to you will depend very much on where you stand politically, but they're both equally correct. It's just that one looks more balanced than the other to portray the actual voting numbers as they were, which were pretty close, as it turns out. So I took Trey's image with permission. I used it as a page in my 2018 book, Cartography, to explore this issue of ethics a little further and what constitutes a truthful map. As we've seen, maps may be accidentally disingenuous about the content. They might use misguided construction or techniques. They may even be deliberately designed to be persuasive or propagandist. The ability to accidentally or deliberately make a map in ways that might misconstrue meaning raises these questions of ethics in cartography. So I looked back in my cartographic literature, and Borden Dent had proposed a set of ethical considerations in his book called Thematic Map Design. And I took that and I looked very much at his ethical ideas and sort of morphed them slightly a little bit, updated them maybe a little bit more. So here's my version of Dent's ethics in cartography statements. You can have a little peruse through. These perhaps are a list of ways in which, as makers of maps, we might attempt to bring truth and objectivity to our process. Things to think about. You can call it a code if you want. I don't particularly like rules as such, but I think what these sorts of statements do is provide a useful practical way of thinking about and applying the concept of ethical map making to the practice of making maps. My particular favourite that I always keep in mind is don't let defaults drive your design. There's a big tendency these days to suggest that, well, that's the way in which the software allowed me to map, or suggested the map which I maybe should have used, or it limited my ability to create the map in my mind's eye. No, not at all. You just have to bend the software in ways that perhaps it wasn't intended to be bent to get to where you want your map to be. But this isn't the only set or list of perhaps ethical considerations. There are others. This is the Locus Charter. We might call this a society version of Code of Ethics, which was developed as part of the American Geographical Society's Ethical Geo Initiative. What it actually does is it's not specifically for mapping, but it seeks to improve the standards of practice in the geosphere more widely. It lists 10 founding principles that are intended as more as a call for action and as a mantra we can abide by as geo-professionals more generally. I don't think there's anything that most reasonable people wouldn't commit to on this particular list. Now, we could argue that in a post-truth world, our individual and collective professional and ethical responsibility is to abide by these types of codes, which guide us to deliver maps that people can genuinely trust. But as we'll see in a minute, that's not necessarily easier done than said. So, as I demonstrated in the examples to this point, all maps lie. Some maps lie more than others. But these kinds of ethical considerations are an attempt to minimise the spectrum from gratuitous lies to accidental lies. And that's perhaps something to keep in mind in itself. Perhaps the little white lies that we infuse maps with to make the main message clearer and which do no harm, I'm kind of fine with those. This is the British Cartographic Society's version. They have a code of ethics that they apply to membership. suggesting people can be expelled from the society for contravening the code. What a terrible, terrible situation to find yourself in. Well, I looked into this and no one's been expelled ever. So does that mean every single member who's ever been a member of the British Cartographic Society can honestly say that all of their maps have been shown these key traits of honesty, integrity, competence, respect, responsibility? I mean, I've seen a lot of maps made by members of BCS, and that's not necessarily the case, and I include some of mine in that. So what is the penalty for non-compliance? It seems awfully brutal, archaic almost, that there should be some sort of penalty. And what does it matter? Or does it matter? This is a mantra, a mapmaker's mantra, made by colleagues at Esri, the company I work for. It wasn't my doing, it was developed by other folks at Esri as a guide for map makers. It has noble intention, just like all of the others. But again, you might sort of sit back and say, well, hang on a second. A privately held company suggesting such guidelines is potentially questionable. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that the people who made these guidelines had anything other than good intent. And of course, you'd hope that all maps made by employees of the company complied with these sorts of guidelines. Okay, at this point, if we were in a room and I could see everybody, I'd test this concept of honesty, integrity, but you can play along a little bit. So I would normally ask this question of how many people in this room make maps. And I would ask people by show of hands. So I would ask everyone to raise their hand. So I would ask you to keep your hand raised if you can honestly say you have no outside influence in map making, no constraints, no organisational requirements, no specifications to adhere to, no clients that are paying you to make the map and have a view and an opinion, and an impact. Now, what usually happens when I ask this question in a room, I think I've only ever had it once where one person had their hand remaining up. Everybody else puts their hand down. So if everybody puts their hands down, that means that there is a situation that exists that means that our hands are literally somewhat tied whenever we're making a map because of the context in which we make those maps. Sometimes, more often than not, we have no full control over the map making process and the look and the feel and the direction of the end product. So even if we agree with all of those guidelines and the mantras and the codes and the value of these, I would question that they are somewhat altruistic aims because we all have paymasters. We can't necessarily be free from constraint to the point of making a truly ethical map. So in some respects, these lists of ethical rules might actually be counterproductive beyond simply guidance. How can you possibly be accountable to a society over and above your employer or your client? It perpetuates the us and them divide in some respects that a lot of new map makers feel. It also gives the appearance of some sort of stuffy dogma, of gatekeeping, of this idea that only cartographers should be allowed to create ethically produced or sustainable maps. We've already seen that's not the case. And how do we communicate these guidelines anyway? I mean, I would suggest most people here or listening to this don't even know of their existence anyway, because they go into the realms of those societies and organisations and basically the room in which people are willing to listen anyway. So it becomes an echo chamber. The sort of people that might need to know these things won't subscribe to these echo chambers or these rooms in our traditional societies and organisations anyway. And anyway, what ethics are we talking about? They're our ethics, or my ethics, or someone else's ethics, but ethics can change. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party have ethics, but likely they wouldn't necessarily match what we might put together as a list of ethics. So how can a single set of ethical guidelines be relative across the melting pot of different people, of different cultures, of different ethics? So I think we should probably move away from what might be seen as rules for cartographic practice to be more inclusive, more empathetic. After all, these sorts of codes are really more about how we conduct ourselves in everyday life. They're not just about how we make maps. But that perhaps doesn't mean anything goes. We can still have rigour in our work. We can still promote the value of good quality cartography. And when we recognise subpar maps, we can perhaps have a better ability to call that out and to illustrate and explain why that map is not perhaps telling as much of the truth as people might otherwise assume it is. Okay, it's time for another musical interlude. Of course, Pink Floyd knew all about this dichotomy and the problem of shifting lines on maps. This is 1973. This is from Dark Side of the Moon, Us and Them. I'm not going to play the whole thing. It's over 8 minutes long. Okay, Pink Floyd. Got to get a bit of Pink Floyd in. So here's the problem, okay, in a nutshell. What happens when we see maps from another domain that clearly contravene any of that list of code, those list of recommendations, the codes, the mantras, or even widely held design standards for effective communication? Well, here's one. This is the classic rainbow colour scale we see an awful lot of weather maps employ, and which get put across our social media feeds almost daily. And we might call it out. This is actually one of my colleagues, Josh Stevens, who makes a lot of these maps, knows an awful lot about colour theory as well. But what happens if we call it out? It doesn't necessarily change anything. It doesn't affect change, and it doesn't necessarily affect change within transigent communities, of which a lot of meteorologists actually are. We get accused of gatekeeping because it's a cheap and easy accusation for those who reject advice. Well, what do? Do we stamp it with disapproval? Of course we don't, because if we do that, the action of the stamp or disapproval is potentially a divisive act anyway. But sometimes people don't like advice, and sometimes people don't like change. In this particular example, a lot of meteorologists claim that they understand this particular colour scheme. That's fine. I'm happy with that. Where I have a particular issue is when they then use the same colour schemes to talk to a general non-scientific audience to consume those maps and understand it in a way in which they claim to understand it. I think in that situation you need a different map. But let's ponder better, perhaps more constructive alternatives. One way we might force ourselves to bring more rigour to our work is through self-reflection and critique. We might keep codes and mantras in mind, but applying them in practice is actually very difficult, as we've seen. Using something like a checklist to help us square off things we should consider when making a map is perhaps a more practical way to justify our decisions, to justify the decisions you've taken in designing the map, to help check you've not missed anything, or if you have, that you've missed it deliberately and in a meaningful way. Do we check to make sure that the conclusions from our maps are sensitive to different choices of methods? Do we think we're free from all the self-serving reasons for making maps? Do we publish maps that support a belief but ignore the ones we don't? Do we make maps, different maps, that at least some of them by chance alone have a pattern we think is interesting? Do we end up seeing what we want to see in our maps, the so-called mirage effect? Or do we just publish maps as a way of avoiding a proper written analytical statement or justification? These are all ways in which we might consider or reflect upon our own cartographies. But I think a checklist goes some way to helping understand that. I think we also need a little bit more than that. We need more than codes, mantras and checklists. We need examples that can help guide people. And in many respects, that's been my intention for the last decade or so in creating alternative maps of different election cycles in the US and the UK. It's my attempt, I guess, to explain, to illustrate how meaning in a map can be designed for good or ill intent and to mediate the message that an electorate might receive. It's useful for both map makers, but also map consumers who perhaps need to be better able to recognise what they're looking at and question what they're seeing. And I just put a couple of URLs on the screen now to go to sort of galleries of maps that you could look at. And I wrote a second book about it. It at least became a starting point for this particular book called Thematic Mapping, 101 Inspiring Ways to Visualise Empirical Data, which is ostensibly about how to design ways to look at electoral data, in fact any data set, but I used electoral data because it was interesting and it captures attention. It's not a new idea though, I stole it because nothing's new. E.P. Herman did it in 1922 in a publication called Maps and Sales Visualization, and Jacques Bertin did the same in his classic Semiology of Graphics in 1983. But, you know, people have said very nice things about this. This did win an award, so must be good, right? And what a lovely thing for someone to say Ken's books are well-written and visually stunning works of art. Well, again, you can't always believe what you read because Ian is a very good personal friend as well as a colleague of mine who works for the company that published that book. So, you know, you do have to look behind what you see a little and I'd like to believe he thinks this of my work, but maybe let's leave it as that. So here's the 2020 result of that same 1 dot equals 1 vote daisyometric dot density approach that I tweeted all too rapidly all those years ago, that I made it into a full, proper, downloadable map. You can actually get a poster of this for free if you're interested. I think it's a fairer way of illustrating the electoral data. So we can use maps not just as a way of visualising something, but also as a teaching moment for design and to learn what works and to learn what doesn't work. The intent really is to help people who make maps to better connect with map readers, and for map readers to better understand the map, how to read it, and what the limitations are. Here's the map I made of the 2024 result. I made it as a Dawling cartogram, very much more of an infographic style than a geographical map. But again, you just have to look at the split between the blue and the red in every state, and they're actually very similar. So when we hear about red states and blue states in terms of US electoral geography, it's not really the truth. It's just that the way in which the political system works in this and many other countries, it means that first past the post gets all of the electoral college votes in that particular state. There's also an Easter egg in this. I'm not going to show you where it is. You can go hunting for it yourself. But just as I said for the Irish surnames map, Easter eggs are great. Put them in any map. It's fun. But what do we think of it as a way to communicate the election result compared to perhaps the last map? Is it as truthful as the 2016 White House map that President Trump put on his wall? Is it more or less truthful than that daisyometric dot density map that I've just shown you? Well, that's partly up for you to decide. It's perhaps more balanced. Most people have said very nice things about that particular map, but as a way to prove that you can't please everyone all the time, I've redacted the person, but this person did not like that map. And they went further by actually sort of illustrating what they thought of was a much more useful graphic to illustrate the results of the election. Well, we could debate this. My personal view, I don't have a clue what that graph is trying to show. Not even at a glance. Not even if I stare at it for an awful long time and look at the different axes and try to look at the different symbols and understand what I've got no idea. So even when you try your hardest to make something that is ethical, that is balanced, that easily and clearly represents the information, people are going to throw it back at you because they think they know better. But I have had some successes. Here's one consequence of the maps I've made for electoral data. In 2016, Donald Trump flipped and won Wisconsin by 0.77%, less than 1%. And this left map is the result of that style. In the style of the map that he had on the wall of the White House. A lot of red. Okay, in the run-up to the 2020 election, I was contacted by a Democratic campaign manager who said that a lot of people in the state were very disillusioned because they looked at that map and couldn't understand how it was such a red state, given what they'd heard on the doorstep. And he wanted a map to give encouragement to the thousands of campaigners that he was encouraging to go out and campaign for the Democratic vote. So I gave him basically a copy of the daisyometric dot density map after I'd done a detailed version of Wisconsin. And it's basically a 50-50 reality. It's virtually all purple, reds and blues mingling everywhere. Perhaps the only discernible difference being Madison itself, which looks a little more tinged towards blue. Well, in 2024, Wisconsin flipped back by 0.9%. So the margins are extremely small in many states in this particular data set, but it does go to prove that different maps can encourage, enthuse different people for different purposes. But rather than contact people like me to ask for map advice, well, where are there other places you can help? Here's the ubiquitous AI slide. My colleague Ian Muhlenhaus has built this. It's called Map Doctor. It's a specialised AI assistant designed to assist in the improvement of map design. You can go to that URL, you can upload a map, and it will provide detailed expert feedback on various aspects of cartography, such as layout, colour use, thematic representation, visual storytelling. It actually works pretty well. It gives pretty wholesome feedback because it's been trained on the last 5 or 6 decades worth of research-led best practices in cartography. Just good, solid design advice. But it's designed to express what works and not how you can break what works usefully. And breaking rules, such as they might exist, is always a good way of creating a map that's going to stick in people's mind's eye. So what we don't want to necessarily recommend is to have a situation where, cartography is simply leading to a whole bunch of sterile maps that all look the same. Diversity in cartography is and remains important. But for many, there exists a status quo in cartography that is deeply embedded in what's gone before. Rules, best practices, dogma, repeated anecdotes, and often this also brings with it cries of gatekeeping, as I've said. It's true that cartographers have historically stuck to what they know, largely because it works. And when asked to prove what we say, we often have to point to some dusty old research in an old journal paper that sits behind a paywall. It's actually a real practical problem in trying to apply or encourage higher ethical standards. I don't know, but maybe it's time to relax a bit and learn how to break a few rules along the way. Do we want a little bit of status quo? Yeah, that's enough. So let me introduce my sort of ongoing work. I'm sort of headed very slowly towards another book where I'm going to try and turn things up to 11. I'm setting out to try and find maybe what best practices remain valid and perhaps where we can bend them a little or a lot. And for that, I'm currently in the process of exploring and reevaluating some of our preconceptions, or perhaps seeing where concepts and ideas born out of studies many decades ago are still relevant. And part of that is to create a modern, up-to-date guide that presents easily digestible evidence for why certain best practices work, or where we might be less prescriptive. It's like Mythbusters, for maps. So to begin with, here's a sort of list of some of the most common mistakes by novice map makers when you compare them to maybe a professional cartographer. And these are the sort of things that most of us are likely to spot fairly rapidly. It's very easy to find these sort of missteps, but the vast majority only occur through naivety and not necessarily by design. Well, simply pointing these out, as I've suggested, and somehow expecting people to revisit and revise is, I think, in many ways futile. Giving people a reason to be curious about understanding the language, the grammar, and the syntax of cartography is perhaps more useful. Then people can make their own cartographic recipes up with knowledge of the ingredients at their disposal and what pairs well together. The point then is to give people a new guide that's both nourishing and satisfying. Now, you can have a look through these, pause the video, but they're a starting point to what I'm trying to achieve in the book by seeing whether they matter anymore. So I've become much more pragmatic, I guess, in the way I think about making maps and how I encourage others. And I think it's a good philosophy to abide by, just to relax a little bit. We should probably move away from thinking about hard and fast rules and codes and mantras and move towards giving people good examples to follow, with explanations to aid their interpretation, whether it's for people making maps or those trying to make sense of the map they're reading. I did particularly like this particular passage of text from Alberto Cairo from a couple of years ago. I really like this, and I modified it again to apply it to the domain of map design. Having justifiable reasons for the decisions you take in making and designing a map, I think, is critical. Rather than stipulate rules, maybe it's better to simply identify best practice and establish why it's considered best practice, or where it's not as hard and fast as perhaps it once was. So people will continue to make maps and push boundaries regardless of what lists or codes we might make, because they won't read them anyway, and many will actually delight in going against perceived dogma. The important aspect in much of this is intent. Every mark should be intentional, and you should be able to justify it all the way from "I just like it" to referencing systematic studies that show important cognitive concepts. Part of that, discussion and critique, are also very important components. But breaking the law seems a useful mantra in itself. Not randomly or without justifiable reason, some of our long-held best practices sustain, but possibly there are new contexts and arenas in which breaking the law judiciously is nothing to get too upset about. Fancy a bit of Judas Priest?
Breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law.
Yeah, not everyone's into a bit of Judas Priest, so it's not just old school heavy metal that encourages you to break the law. If you prefer a different era, then here's Charlie XCX encouraging the same, though I have to admit I've never listened to this track, and frankly I don't know who the other performer is as well. She'll probably not amount to very much.
I don't wanna go to school, I just wanna break the rules. Boys and girls across the...
Okay, but caveat emptor, or map reader beware. X doesn't always mark the spot, as Robert Louis Stevenson's classic Treasure Island map revealed or didn't reveal. No matter how well designed, aesthetically pleasing and believable a map may appear to be, they can still tell completely fictitious lies. The job of the so-called professional cartographer has changed largely from the professional employed to turn someone's idea into reality, Charles Scheffins or Heinrich Beran, to one of educator, helping people translate the work of their own domain into great visuals. So my job over the last 35 years has gone from educator to a practitioner who educates. I can't simply tell people how to make a map anymore. I have to show them and help them understand why. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. I hope you made it to the end. Here's my contact details and also a hub site that you can go to download a whole load of stuff. Thanks very much. Bye.